They told me I have to use this, so, right? I need the microphone. My name is Yrjo. I'm an investment manager at Change Ventures, which is a venture capital fund that invests into ambitious Baltic founders around the world. So if you have a seed stage company and you're looking for money, then come talk to me. I know I'll be talking to you later on, maybe some others as well. I'm very humbled that you came out here, braved the monsoon, and filled all the seats, and we even had a wait list for this event. That's fantastic. Well, let's hope that I make your time here this morning worthwhile. I sent the slides last night to the organizers, and I got an email back at like 9 or 10 o'clock at night asking whether I'd looked at the title of my actual speech. It was a bit of a surprise because I had actually looked at it. I'd even made the slides, but let's see if I can make the connection in your mind. I'll ask you at the end, because feedback is important. I'll ask you at the end if I have fulfilled my promise to talk about genius and how we invest into genius and how we find or try to identify geniuses for our startups. There's different schools of thought. I have seen blogs that talk about the team being 30% of the investment decision. I have seen people who say 50%. I have seen, in fact, a month ago, there was a blog article where the venture capitalists said 90%. 90% of our decision is the team. How smart they are, how many geniuses you have on that team, that determines whether we put money in or not. 90% is a lot. I mean, you could have a totally shit idea, right, and have 90% great team and make money. And I think maybe early on, the earlier you are in the investment stage, probably the team is more and more important. Once you have found that product market fit, you're already a multi-million-dollar company with recurring revenues. Maybe that genius isn't so important anymore, and you can bring in more traditional CEOs, more transactional CEOs. But when you're starting, it really does take something special. If you want to know now what's my percent, I don't know. Somewhere around 50. I'm not so brave as to go all out on someone 90%. And I'm definitely not so pessimistic as to think that, well, it's all market and all the other stuff to go as low as 30%. So I think it's somewhere in between. It's about half is really the importance of the team and who's on that team. So I would like to go through now and talk about how we try to put some faces to these superstars, to these geniuses that we'd like to see in our portfolio companies. But defining genius, I just punched it into Wikipedia and looking at, well, how do people define it? There was a whole host of different definitions. One of the ones that I really enjoyed was sort of a lyrical definition from Samuel Johnson, 18th century poet. Well, we've got a little bit of a Microsoft. Well, there goes Bill Gates as a genius, right? Can convert between Apple and PowerPoint. But he defined it as fire in the flint. It's only to be produced by the collision with the proper subject. When you collide with a proper subject, suddenly, poof, the genius comes out, and everybody will recognize it. I'm not quite as lyrical or optimistic as the poet here, so I tried to look for some other definitions that may be a little more workable. Let's see. Hey, this one came out okay. This is the one that seems like that has become more and more established and popular. It's a person that has done something great, and it has also withstood the time, the fashion, the trends and such. But when I start thinking about that, then only names like, artists and maybe scientists come to mind, right? The greats of, Newton, Einstein, Mozart, they have withstood really time and fashion, and people to this day, right? You go on a classical station on your radio, where 300-400 years later, and you can hear Mozart, right? You go and you study physics in school, several hundred years later, and you're still reading about Newton. So yes, these are the geniuses truly that have withstood the time and would fall under this definition, but it becomes much more difficult if you start now trying to think of, what about business people, business leaders that would fall under the same definition, that have stood the pressures of time and fashion and all of that. And I found it pretty difficult to really have those names. And the only ones that came to mind were J.P. Morgan, maybe. People kind of, sort of, I see some heads nodding, you've heard that name before, right? Maybe Rockefeller, right? There's, to this day, all kinds of endowments, etc. Krupp in Europe. Not maybe Edison, but really not much more. If you go to a true startup fanboy, then of course they're like, well, what about Musk? What about Jobs? You know, they're the geniuses of our time. You know, it's the only reason I wear turtlenecks. Well, I think that may fall, you know, short of this fashion and fame issue. So I'm not exactly sure, and let's examine that a little bit later. But I found it difficult to find so-called business geniuses that have stood this test, which is in itself interesting. So what have we used traditionally to measure this genius? How do we identify them? And the IQ test seems to be the way that a lot of people have done it, especially in the 20th century. IQ seemed to be the way to go, right? Let's put everybody to a test, A, B, C, D, circle the right answer. If you get enough right answers, you get a certain score above 120, 130, you're a genius. Done, boom, label, you're a genius, right? Well, there's problems with that. Specifically, even early on, in the 1920s, Stanford started a test. In fact, where the IQ test came from was this Lewis Terman study, where he was gathering data on a bunch of smart kids. He would give them what became later known as the IQ test. He would give them the test and gather all of the data, and then he followed them from 1921 to 1959. It's a very long time to determine what was the connection between their score on the IQ test and then how they turned out in life. And I found the answer is very interesting. The test predicted no Nobel or Pulitzer Prize or any major prize winners at all. On the other hand, people who were considered not smart enough for Terman, there were a couple of Nobel Prize winners. So the stupid ones actually won the Nobel Prize and the Pulitzers and everything else, and the smart ones didn't get nothing, didn't walk away with any prizes. And he did find that after 120, once you got to a certain stage, it really didn't matter in terms of a connection to success. So whether you're 120, 130, 140, 170, there was no correlation between that score above 120 and being successful in life or being successful in science or being successful in business. In other words, once you were smart, you know, enough, that was enough. It's kind of like if you think of basketball players, you know, if you're already 2 meters tall and playing as a center, whether you're 2 meters and 1 centimeter, 2 meters, 2 centimeters, it's probably enough already. You're already tall enough to play basketball. You're already tall enough to be that center. And that little bit at the top no longer makes a huge difference. And entirely other things come in to make that difference. So you may ask reasonably, well, you know, what is it that, was there some big takeaway that does make a difference? Yes. If you're wealthy, from a wealthy family, you were absolutely predisposed to be successful. Totally unfair, yes, completely. But that was one of the findings. There was an extremely strong correlation that if you were from a wealthy family, and the more wealthy, the more successful probably you were. Well, you know, chances are your dad or your mom gave you a job already at a pretty good starting place, and if you had a decent enough IQ already, then you quickly rose and you became very successful. So you had a ladder up, and fair or not fair, hey, That's what came out of the study. It was just numbers. But I think all of this should have indicated to a lot of people that IQ test may not be really the best thing to be judging people by. And maybe this is also why does anybody here put your IQ on your CV? No, right? I haven't seen it yet. I haven't seen a CV come in, a big box in the corner, 175. Probably because it's not a very good indicator. And if it would have been, I think people would be using it today. It would be, something that we would all talk about, right? This is my score, and you would get hired or not hired based on that. If you want to know more about this kind of study and what is the connection between IQ and success, I recommend there's a chapter 4, I think, but don't quote me on that. But in Outliers, there's an entire chapter on different smart people and tracking them and how they turned out. So Malcolm Gladwell, Outliers, I recommend further reading on that topic. So here's one smart person. You know this guy, right? Yeah? Hand up. Come on, you know. You know who this guy is. Yeah, you know. Very smart guy, right? But probably lacking on many dimensions. This asshole here is Steve Jobs, of course. You can see he would only park in the handicapped spot because his time was too valuable. Let the handicapped people crawl on their knees from the back of the lot to work because he's got things to do, right? He's got to get his fresh frappuccino. And you can actually see top down, top up, doesn't matter. He's always in that. Oh, you may also notice he does not use a license plate because he said he's too rich. There's no need, just write me a ticket. He also didn't have a license, a driver's license, because, hey, what's the point? Just give me the ticket. How much is it? I can pay you 5 times ahead, then you don't have to stop me next 5 days. So maybe a very smart guy, but clearly lacking some things. And I'm not even going to get into the, in the middle of the night, calling for a certain shade of calla lilies, and then when somebody brings them, he throws them in their face because he says they're the wrong shade, and all of that. Here's some more examples. People who you might be calling, or maybe a couple months ago might have called geniuses, and suddenly the test of time takes their toll, and Travis at Uber maybe doesn't look so much a genius anymore, right? And Elizabeth at Theranos doesn't look so much a genius. Therefore, that earlier definition does have some relevance, of being able to call who's a genius on the spot is very difficult because a month, 2 months goes by and suddenly in the news you see that all of Theranos is pretty much, fake. And with Travis, well, you know the story. So aside from just being smart, I think that 20th century measure of IQ, something else has come along that I think really plays a very pivotal role in deciding who's a good team member. What kind of a genius do you want? What kind of superstar do you want on your team? And if you look, there's things on here that aren't in any way covered on an IQ test, like self-awareness, empathy. Nobody asks you empathy questions on an IQ test, right? Social skills, like not parking in a handicapped spot, things like that. Self-regulation, all of these types of measurements are very important if you want to actually work in teams. And teamwork is, I think, more and more important. Statistically, there have been studies now that over the past 50 years, we have almost doubled the number of authors of patents and also of scientific articles. Part of the reason is that we have picked off the low-hanging fruit. Sort of the easier inventions, the simpler things have already been done. And the challenges we are now attacking are more and more complicated. They're more and more difficult, so they require different types of people and different interdisciplinary teams. So if you're going to have that kind of team of people from different backgrounds, from different countries, different races, different religions, then just having a high IQ isn't going to get you anywhere. You're going to have a very, very difficult time getting this team to work together, to be motivated, and to push towards a goal. But these things, like empathy, social skills, your own self-awareness and regulation, they play a pivotal role in working within that team. So emotional intelligence, I think, as a measure of genius, is becoming more and more relevant and more important when hiring or picking who is it that you want to put your money into, so that you don't end up with the Travis or Elizabeth situations where overnight, your stock may drop 30% or something. Another dimension, somebody giving me time, because I could go on forever, right? You'll tell me. Another dimension that I'd like to bring in here is PQ. I just made that up. There is no PQ. Okay, don't go look that up because it doesn't exist. I just, for the sake of this talk, I made up this measure called PQ, practical intelligence, right? And what do I mean by that? I mean the passion, the courage, the drive, the perseverance of the person to push through with the project. Again, this is something, IQ test does not measure your passion. And even your EQ measurements, various, often don't go into, well, how long can you withstand pressure? How much of a drive do you have? How long can you withstand, losing as a startup and bootstrapping and nobody wants your product, and keep pushing at it and keep pushing at it. So this type of practical intelligence, which encompasses all of these types of skills, I think is becoming also more and more important in recognizing that you're going to have a true genius, a real powerful team member that can pull through from investment all the way to making and building a successful company. Because emotional intelligence may not be enough. You may be very empathetic. Traditional IQ may not be enough. You may be super smart. But you also have to have this kind of courage and drive in the face of adversity to keep going, keep taking the no's, and just still grinding until you get to those customers. So hence this type of additional dimension that we are very fond of at Change Ventures. In fact, my partner, Andres Bergins, wrote a good blog article. You can go to our website, changeventures.com, and check out his blog on this topic, where he wrote about Angela Duckworth's book, Grit, which is my recommendation for if you want to know more about PQ. Again, made that up. It's not in there. But if you want to know more about how does courage, passion, drive, and perseverance, how do these things play a role and how important they are in creating a successful company, then go to this book, Grit, to check that out. So just to be clear, what did I mean by this practical intelligence is really the ability to take your IQ and EQ and use your innate grit to achieve exceptional results. AI, I didn't make that up, that's real. Artificial intelligence is real. And in the age of artificial intelligence, which I think we all recognize that we are now living in, where we have both machine learning and artificial intelligence coming online, I think we are getting a brand new challenge. So aside from the first three types of intelligence or first three types of genius, I think we are going to need an entirely new type of skill, entirely new type of genius that will be required to really succeed in this age. Here's an interesting headline. This was on the cover of Boston newspaper after Einstein went to Boston for the first time. Einstein sees Boston, fails Edison test. Well, that's because some journalist, trying to be flippant, trying to be cool, asked him the question, well, what's the speed of sound, And Einstein said, I don't know. because you can look that up in a book. Why would I carry that information in my head, right? Well, in the age of AI and ML, everything is in a book. Better yet, everything is on the internet, right? So if we have mobile devices always with us, and we have connection to be able to always look up, whether it's the speed of sound or the speed of light or any formula or anything like that, then using this Einstein type of thinking, there's no need to memorize any of that. So in the age of AI and ML, the person of genius and intelligence is no longer the person who's able to memorize pi to the millionth, degree, or the one that has all the chemical and physical mathematical formulas in his head and is that idiot savant that Rain Man that can count matches and whatnot or count cards. It's the person who's best able to unlock this knowledge from the internet or from other electronic sources. So therefore, really, we get to something I made up. AI, augmented intelligence. Yes, there is no augmented intelligence anywhere either. Don't look that up. But for the sake of this talk, I've named this augmented intelligence. And here's Bill Gates fucking with me again. But what I mean by augmented intelligence is taking all of the things we just talked about earlier, which is emotional intelligence, traditional IQ, together with practical intelligence, and now adding this brand new skill that's emerging, which is the ability to augment all of your genius with that outside knowledge. What is it that AI and ML can provide to make you that much smarter? This is something revolutionary, because if you really think about the combined knowledge that's available from AI and ML, suddenly a person can instantly jump to the level of Einstein and beyond, right? Unlocking all of his knowledge on a laptop or his mobile phone. So if you have truly that skill and you're able to take that knowledge and plug it in with your IQ, EQ, and PQ, then you have a fantastically powerful leader and a fantastically powerful team member. And that is something, obviously, any investor would look for. And so I think this will be a brand new skill that we'll have to all develop to get stronger. So in your team, you're probably looking for these people with IQ, EQ, PQ, AI. The problem is people of high IQ, just 1 or 2% or top 5%, are usually not the ones that also have the high EQ. They're also like a few percent. Are usually not the ones also that have the PQ, the practical intelligence, a few percent. Are usually not the ones who are also good at AI. That's just a few percent. And with probabilities, you don't add them, right? You multiply. So as they're just small percentages each of them, to think, does one person have all of those 4 in that one body? Highly unusual. I mean, we're talking well below 1% in human beings, right? So this is why investors are so keen to hear about your team and your team dynamic, because often maybe IQ may be really high here and EQ really high here, and then the practical and AI knowledge really high here, so that it's not all in one person's head or body, but it's in the entire team. And this is also why, if you look at the Startup Genome Project, which showed that the single largest predictor of whether a startup is going to be successful or fail is whether it's a one-person startup. If a one-person team is trying to break through, well, we just talked about it. The chance that the one person has everything going for them, not very likely. You're probably going to have a combination of people on the team, different skill sets, and have them work together to really get the maximum impact and be able to be really the best team to run that startup. So, something that tickles me, genius and madness. It's got nothing to do with the rest of this investment topic, but I just love to think about this kind of thing. I think all of us have been kind of curious about, well, is there any connection between these really smart people and madness? And the answer is yes, absolutely. This has been repeatedly tested and studied. There are clear correlations, in fact, between madness and this high intelligence in these various categories. And it comes, the way it's described, if you want to read more about it, is read about the big 5 personality traits. And one of them traditionally has been called openness and intelligence. But in the last 10 years, there's a whole new branch that has emerged saying this is not one personality trait, openness/intelligence, but in fact 2 separate ones. Because openness, really what we're talking about openness in people is divergent thinking. And when we're talking about intelligence is convergent thinking. Let me explain that. Convergent thinking would be perfectly like an IQ test where you have A, B, C, D, and there's one right answer, right? Whatever that is, A, B, or all of the above, or none of the above. There's a very specific answer. That's convergent thinking. You're able to converge onto the right answer. Well, divergent thinking, which is openness, is a test where they would say, give me every possible explanation of what the hell this thing is. Right? And there is no right answer. I think it's a chair. It could be a speaker. But that's divergent thinking, right? There is no right answer. It's not on that page in front of you. Nobody tells you the answer. That's divergent thinking, is being able to think in completely different models in different ways. And that's very, very different than convergent thinking, where the answer actually was there the whole time in front of you. You just have to converge onto the right one. Divergent thinking comes from openness, and divergent thinking is much broader and more sustained and more powerful with people who exhibit some aspects of mental disability. That's that's the bottom line of where the scientists in psychology have gone into this topic, is studying mainly schizophrenia and looking at those people and the presence of the genes, schizophrenic genes, within populations. There was a study 4 years ago from Iceland looking at their Academy of Sciences and their Academy of Artists, and genes that were related to schizophrenia were 20% more represented in both academies versus the regular population. Similar study in Sweden, similar studies in Germany. There have been also many studies of scientists and musicians and writers, and who we call geniuses often exhibit mental illness, traits of mental illness. The connection there is that this mental illness, schizophrenia would be the 1% of population that has a very, very serious mental illness, and these people probably couldn't be on your startup team. You would have a very difficult time. But as we move on the scale to more lighter forms, such as schizotypy and apophenia, apophenia would be something like not wanting to step on, stripes on pavement, or seeing on your toast like, oh my God, that looks like Batman. It's like, no, your toaster is not making Batmans. but this type of thinking, if you have that kind of thinking, you at least have this predisposition to start, your mind is making these connections and feels free enough to do that. And that allows for divergent thinking. So in that sense, that's very positive. Because if all you say is, that's toast, and toast is toast, and there's nothing on there, ever, toast, that person is going to have a really hard time doing divergent thinking because he's going to say, that's toast. The more you can open up and think what else it could be or what other pictures or things or messages, for that matter, you might be getting through your toast, those people generally actually are much more creative and come up with much more interesting solutions to problems that the toast people have never been able to do before because they just saw one answer, a convergent answer in front of them. So in that sense, yes, genius and madness absolutely correlated, absolutely connected, and don't be afraid to go out on a limb and look at people who have even serious mental handicaps to be included on your team. Here's some people you might recognize who had quite serious mental problems. Some extremely debilitating and serious, so that they couldn't, quite a few of them committed suicide. All of these people had recognizable, strong mental problems. But all of them also have achieved quite a bit, I would say, as geniuses. So that's my talk about genius. And I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you. One. Thank you, Yrjo. Let's close.
Thanks.
It was very inspiring for the morning, start your brains working, okay.
Well, you ran out of coffee, so I had to.
Okay, so raise your hands, I will come.
Can I talk? Yeah. So I'm still not quite sure whether you were talking about geniuses or successful people, because if we call the current geniuses, like this startup owners and employees, geniuses, how would we call this Da Vinci, Kafka? I think that the label of genius, like the masterpiece, must be reserved for some exceptional people. And I'm still not quite sure whether you can put in one group the people you listed with their names and the people who would fulfill all these criteria, because Einstein didn't make a good employee. Kafka was not successful. He was not driven. He didn't believe in himself, but still he was a genius. So I'm not quite sure if this is the same word to use for the...
I'm not sure either.
Okay.
I think that's, and the reason why I'm not sure is exactly what you pointed out. I think in the definition, because there's various definitions, I can make it fit, I can force it fit, but if we use the definition that I personally also believe, which includes, specifically uses the word, in time and excludes fashion and all of that, then it is very difficult to say whether any of our current business leaders or such will be seen in the future as geniuses at all. I agree with you. Yes, it is very, very difficult to make that determination, but it's also sort of a meta-Buddhist thing, right? We can't make these decisions even today. We would have to go 200 years from now, look back, and then only be able to say whether Elon Musk is a genius or not, right? It's not a call we can make today, because if we include the dimension of time into it, for him to be a timeless revolutionary of space travel and fighting AI by building the off button and all of these things, these may be brilliant, amazing things, right? But we will not know this until several hundred years from now. So I agree with you, yes. So in that sense, I also agree with you that most of what I was talking about is more like an Aristotelian yearning and striving towards genius without achieving. I think that's more the process here, is trying to better yourself and trying to find leaders who want to advance and reach towards genius, quite likely never reaching it.
So where we had
Don't
here.
give it to Gleb.
I wanted to come back to Steve Jobs, and so he might have been he might have been an asshole, but he did make Apple one of the most valuable companies.
He also got fired from Apple, right?
True. So
he also had one of the most unsuccessful products, which he had complete control of.
Yes, but I think it's how to kind of reconcile it. Sometimes hassles can be very
great
successful,
at image,
but really bad for the team. So, like team well-being.
Kind of like Trump. Is he a genius? He made it to president.
No, for example, like with Uber.
So no was to Trump is not a genius, or no, he didn't make it to president.
No, I don't think Trump is a genius.
Okay.
but I think there are people who, despite being assholes, they make great contributions, which doesn't justify tolerating them. But like Uber, what they built is a very successful product up until Trevor was fired. It still is a very successful. Well, they're not making money a lot, I think, but
yeah, I think the point you're making is valid. Without a doubt, Elon Musk and Steve Jobs have severe, or one had severe personality issues, and were terrible to work with. I mean, just look at Elon and his relationship with his wife, right? Divorced 3 times or something. Twice or 3 times with the same one too, and he told her that wife should have about 9 to 10 hours a week of time. Let's schedule it in, and should be happy, right? So I imagine it's not very easy to be with a person like that, right? So an hour and 0.25 per day. Sorry, you're out of time. But they did have skills. I think. Regarding Steve Jobs, he was a master at one specific thing, which was like this presentation, the image, getting style. He was amazing at that. But if you read Wozniak, he couldn't really code. He couldn't really work on hardware. He couldn't really do anything, to make these computers. But he was excellent at pitching and presenting. Right, so the image part of it was he was very, very good, and I think that is something worth emulating. The problem is that a lot of the time people will take this as, oh well, he's a genius now, so I can adopt his style and be an asshole also. Just because he was an asshole, this is no alibi for you to be one, right? So take the good parts, not the bad parts. That's why I'm hesitant to name him, a genius.
Right. I'd go back to the practical intelligence. That actually practical intelligence exists, and it's,
I didn't make that up.
Yeah, you didn't make it up,
cool.
but the things that you listed under that were slightly different things. That practical intelligence is something that your ability, let's say, to come up with creative ways or to solve real-life problems. Let's say your doorknob is broken. How do you fix it? It's something, real-life stuff.
But those are not in a startup or business context.
Sure.
Yeah.
It's just that the things that you mentioned are more closely linked to these personality traits. For example, the perseverance is really highly correlated with conscientiousness. So you'd be looking for someone who's conscientious, I guess.
Those are
in this sense.
That argument is I think very well presented and by you, but also NPR. If you want to, hear more about it, National Public Radio did a long interview with Angela Duckworth, which was using many of those arguments because her book and her scientific paper were peer-reviewed. And those criticisms were, I think, very well put forth, and I think there's a lot of truth to those criticisms. As to her work, grit, and her work in schools trying to teach grit, and at the military academy, West Point, trying to teach grit, I think there is a lot of overlap. Once we get into these psychological traits and personality traits, it becomes very difficult. It's to delineate between them. And I don't want to say it's soft science, but definitions and the specific area that you're talking about the context becomes more and more important. But I think you're right. I think there is a lot of the practical things that I named practical that are really under maybe emotional intelligence. But I was trying to define something additional than just emotional intelligence, and that's I don't know how to put this super hard work. It's not just hard work, right? Hard work, average population understands what hard work is, but in a startup context, it is well above and beyond just working hard. I mean, we're talking about 14-hour days, maybe for several years in a row, 7 days a week, okay? And being able to have the perseverance to push through that while still getting constantly rejected and getting no's from your customers, that's a skill or ability or strength that's beyond sort of the standard measure of an emotionally intelligent person. It's something more, and that's what I was driving at. Hence my disclaimer that I made that up.
So hands, please, for questions. Raise your hands who had questions. Okay, someone back here?
Okay, you can give it to Gleb.
So we have 2 questions, right, or 3? Are you asking?
Hi. So my question is more about practical part. So if it comes to interviewing people, for example, engineers, you every time you just finishing with some checkboxes, like does this person has those skills or not? So in your practical life in venture capital, do you have some checkboxes, like if this company has EQ, like PQ, anything like that? And what do you do if you're seeing that this company is lacking some like PQ, for example? Are you offering them, are you trying to like give them another founder? Like
the answer is yes and yes.
Okay, thank you.
Okay,
have you any examples?
An actual checklist, mainly in my head. But before any investment is made, I think at every professional venture fund, you have to write up a memorandum where you have to describe that team, and you'll describe their strengths and weaknesses, in writing separately to yourself, to your management board, and quite possibly to your general partners. So in order to be able to write paragraphs about them, you have to ask questions of that team, right? So in that sense, yes, you absolutely do look for these things. And if you see that, this team is lacking something, then either you tell them, hey, no deal, we can't invest into you because a major part is missing. But if you think that the deal is so good, the other people are so good, or somebody that can be added to it, then you recommend, hey, what about adding this role? Typical in the Baltics is that sales is not very strong, right? You're going to go on the US market. You're going to need somebody who's a real open, outgoing, be able to knock on every door. You're going to need a specific kind of person. If they aren't on that team, you're going to recommend, hey, you need to recruit this person, and maybe even recommend it. If you have a nice wide network of contacts, you might even know a name right off the top of your head to say, this will be a good addition to your team.
I'd like to extend on this question. So having a checkbox, yes, but how do you actually recognize the people who have a good EQ or PQ or anything else? I understand that the answer to this question is actually have a 5+ years in interviewing or team leading, anything communicated with people, but maybe there is some simple tricks that you actually follow, except of years of experience.
Come on. But most people are not very good actors. If they're really good actors, they're usually in theater or in movies. So if you have enough lunches or coffees with them, the facade will crack, so that if they're acting, if they're pretending to be tolerant and understanding and be able to work with others, something will come out in these meetings. If you have real conversations with the people and ask them open-ended questions and have real conversations with them, ask them about books they read and why, what was their favorite, ask them about their favorite movies, things like that, it will reveal enormous amount about those individuals. And you will have, I think, a more complete picture than just standard, interview questions. And if you combine that knowledge also with your team members, because we've been talking right now about looking at startups as a team. Well, we're a team also as a venture capital company. There's 3 partners at Change Ventures, me, Rait, and Andris Bergins. We are all very, very different. Rait would not be standing here talking to you guys. Andris is off in Lithuania right now doing his thing. We have very different skills. And if I want to get a more complete picture about you, I will often invite one or both of them to that lunch. And then after the lunch or dinner or whatever conversation we have with you, we will all compare sort of our viewpoints. And because we have intentionally, specifically picked our team also with different sets of skills that are complementary, because I'm probably only good at 1 or 2 things. Andres and Rait are probably better at more things, but that's why I needed them, right? To complement, to make us stronger. But once we combine all of those viewpoints, I think we'll have a much more well-rounded picture also of the interviewee. And that's not a trick, but it will come out, from that kind of a process. I think a more complete, honest picture will come out. And more fair to you too, so it isn't just one guy with his peculiarities deciding like, oh, I don't like you,
Hey, I will try to be
kind, gentle.
Brief is what I was trying to say. A few years ago, a Japanese investment company named a thing called Vital brought it to its board. So it took an AI system and it made it part of its investment decision process. Now, I don't know whether it was a marketing ploy because it's the world's first or whatever, but it set a precedent. And from this point, I have a question. Many things you talked about, they involve with our involve our human mind, so consciousness. And the other thing that you talked about AI, which is pretty much intelligence, artificial intelligence. Do you need basically a consciousness to make decisions? Maybe you just need intelligence. And this is, I guess, the key question here. What do you see as the role of consciousness when it comes down to decisions, and do you need it?
This reminds me a little bit of the ethical questions related to companies in general. Under the law, people and companies are treated the same. A company can go and apply for licenses, can get a bank account, a company can buy houses, do all kinds of things, just like people. A company will have a body, just like we have a body. The problem is companies don't have a soul. And that brings in now the ethical dimension. And I think with the AI, and bringing AI aboard, it's something similar. It will have a body, its machine and its programming that's in there. The question is, how much a soul does it have that ameliorates or balances or guides the actions and decisions of that body? And in that sense, I would be afraid at this stage to give too much weight to AI decisions, because it would not have the conscious ethical foundation for those decisions. For example, you know, AI may decide, the best resource to be investing into is, I don't know, phosphorite in Estonia. So what we're going to do is we're going to dig up all of Estonia, because the best investment would be to make a giant hole instead of Estonia, right? So decision made, let's start digging. And because it would be a purely zero-sum mathematical type of decision, which would actually be maybe correct. You know, if you look at the value underground, brought out, extracted, sold, it might be a fantastic investment, but because it does not have the context provided by ethics and these other things which would go under a softer definition of soul or something like that, it would not be necessarily the correct decision. Is that what you were getting at, or I may have misunderstood your question?
No wrong answer here, man. No, thank you. You gave me insight. I guess if I would add a little bit more, ethics. Now, we as a species are not very good at sometimes making ethical decisions. Anything from companies in India during the times of the British Empire, exploitation, opium wars, tulip bubbles, and Dutch, and J.P. Morgan and the company J.P. Morgan Chase is one of many companies in that area that don't, well, if you ask them it's your job to bring profits to shareholders or make ethical decisions, well, I think they're going to go with profits. So if the fiduciary duty of the CEO management is to increase the stockholder value, and, well, so maybe the AI would be better at that. Well, I guess what I'm saying is, in that context, in your business, in your field, maybe the end game would be not have a consciousness and maybe just have intelligence that serves to maximize stockholder value. And this is, I guess, a question directed towards more of your values, if you know what I mean. So I would like to understand how you think.
Was this clear? As kind of a dilettante Buddhist, I like to think that that I try to make myself better and make things around me better. And the investments I have proposed and investments that I supported so far, I believe are all guided by that principle, that they are companies that in fact are solving a real problem and making the world better in some specific niche where they are operating. And in that sense, I'm very much guided by that principle that you know, the target, the investment target, the team, and the company that I'm putting money into is something that has as its goal, end game, something positive, and something that will bring more value to people and the industry as well. I recognize what you're saying in terms of J.P. Morgan and some of these other large banks and conglomerates, and I think this is brought into perspective also, and it kind of eats away at me a little bit, this concept from 0 to 1, the book by Peter Thiel, where he talks about, you know, what is the ultimate startup? Well, the ultimate startup is the one that's going to become a monopoly. And in fact, the Morgans and the Rockefellers and all of them made all their money by killing and eating until they became monopolies, right? And the reason why they became so wealthy is because they took some part of the industry that they absolutely dominated and then became the single player in the field, and then they were able to raise prices, etc. Some people say that may have happened with Google, forgetting about its slogan of do no evil, and now being essentially the go-to search engine and everything else. Sometimes, you know, our best wishes, thoughts, desires have unforeseen consequences. I think so has Google in terms of developing into this behemoth and maybe not quite following their do no evil mantra anymore. But it is something that I consciously think about before an investment. Plus, we've had this discussion with Rait and Andris, things that we would not invest into, you know, some specific categories. For example, in fintech, I feel very uncomfortable with certain loan products, which I think are absolutely preying on individuals with problems, with astronomical interest rates that mathematically it's just not possible for them to pay back. I feel very uncomfortable investing into something like that, even if it would be profitable. Nothing wrong with fintech as an area, but within fintech, there will be niches where I see specifically that I would be bothered by the business model. Even in gaming, you know, games technology, if you look at most people that pay within games, you know, to get the additional coins or jewels or whatever, are people that are hooked on the games, and then games are designed to hook those people. I haven't considered gaming investments, but that is something I would have to think about, is how heavily is that built in there, that you're preying on the weaknesses or straight up, you know, medical problems of some people not being able to handle compulsion and gambling. You know, these are all issues that we have talked about internally, and I take them seriously.
Okay. It was like the second part already for interviewing mostly you, it seems. Okay, so if you have some time, maybe people can come and ask you more questions here, because we need to finish. And I think some of you need, maybe all of you, of course, need to go to work as it's early morning. So we have one surprise. We have one present for Yrjo. It is not flowers. You can actually eat it.
This I love blueberries. Wonderful.
This is the surprise.
Wow. It's gorgeous.